during this, Otoya was not the only person. In fact, this news was bad that Otoya had decided what he was going to literally write down and deliver it. Now, Otoya had not quite figured out what he was going to write, but he knew whatever it was, it have to be perfect. For months now, Otoya had been trying to articulate bad news, being heavily adults and everybody who would listen, but nobody took Otoya. Adults would look at it, oh, that's just a kid. What are you talking about? Otoya would talk to his classmates. Otoya frowned and he looked out the window. He thought to himself, I'm coming off as too angry to talk about this. Maybe I should about it to sound more. As Otoya was thinking about this, he suddenly thought, oh my God, Otoya ran over to his brother's desk, grabbed a piece of paper and a pen, and started writing. Over the last year, Otoya had felt like he had up, started to decline. He had been raised in a very strict household. His father was a colonel in the military, expected Otoya to be obedient and polite. That was what. But a couple of years earlier, Otoya had managed for a spot in Tokyo, far from where, not far from his mother. That was really felt like going to Tokyo to finally allow him to get out from under his dad's strict authority. His father had let him go to the high school in Tokyo, but after only Otoya's father had said, nope, I don't want you to go there. Otoya come back home, go to a post. It over a couple of times, and he realized he was missing one more line at the bottom. And so he leaned down and he wrote, quote, I can't forgive you. Feeling like he was done, he folded up the note, put it in his pocket. He stood up, he grabbed his school uniform jacket and put it on. And then he grabbed this package that he had got from his father's house and he put it under his arm. And then he headed out the front door. Otoya always loved the walk downtown. The hall where this debate was going to take place was near the Imperial Palace, and it was this big, imposing building with a terracotta and stone facade that always inspired Otoya every time he saw it. When Otoya arrived at the hall, he saw loads of people streaming in through the front doors for this debate, and so Otoya joined them and made his way inside, and he moved towards the back of the auditorium, and then he began scanning the audience. And he saw there was at least 2,000 people inside, happily chatting and laughing and waiting for this thing to start. But all Otoya could think about was where this person was that he was going to be meeting, because as he was looking around, he didn't see them. At around 2:45 p.m., the moderator of this debate walked up onto the stage down in front. He went to the podium, he grabbed the mic, and he began telling the audience to take their seats and to be quiet, and then he began to explain the rules for this debate. Otoya at this point was really only half listening because he was still looking all around the inside of this hall for this person he was going to meet. Where are they? They're not here. 15 minutes later, at around 3 p.m., the moderator left the podium and a new speaker came out on stage. He was a politician named Inajiro Asanuma, and he was the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. But when he began to speak and all the thousands of people in attendance leaned in to listen, Otoya was totally not listening because he could now see the person he was going to meet had arrived. Careful not to cause a disturbance, Otoya moved from the back of the auditorium over to the side of the building, and he began walking up a side aisle, only stopping briefly near a trash can where he pulled out that package he had brought from his father's house, and he unwrapped it and he threw the wrapping away and held on to what was inside of the package. And then Otoya looked down at what he was holding, he took a deep breath, and then he looked up and broke into a run. What happened next was broadcast live on television all across Japan, and by that evening, the footage had gone so viral that it was basically all over the world. A photographer who happened to be in the crowd of people watching this debate also happened to take a very iconic photo of what happened next involving Otoya, and that photo would actually go on to win the Pulitzer Prize in 1961. The Pulitzer Prize is a really big deal. It's the most prestigious award for journalism. It would turn out the very important person that Otoya was supposed to meet inside of this hall during this debate was in fact the speaker on stage at 3 p.m., Inajiro Asanuma, the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. And the package that Otoya had brought from his father's house to this meeting was a samurai sword. And so after Otoya unwrapped the sword, he took a deep breath and then ran up on stage, charged to the podium, pulled back the sword, and plunged it into Asanuma's torso before he could do anything. And the photographer out in the crowd who would win the Pulitzer happened to snap a photo right as Otoya was pulling the sword out of Asanuma and getting ready to stab him again. Onlookers would immediately rush the stage and tackle Otoya, but the damage was already done. Asanuma would pass away from his injuries within the hour. It would turn out Otoya, ever since moving to Tokyo, had become a radical right-wing ultranationalist. The note that Otoya had carefully penned and then folded up and put in his pocket before carrying out this assassination basically just said that Otoya did not hate Asanuma personally, but Asanuma was slowly transforming Japan into a communist country, and so Otoya could not forgive him for that. And so Otoya decided he needed to act. Otoya was immediately arrested, but 2 weeks later, while he was in prison, he would take his own life. There is exactly one YouTube channel that I personally religiously follow. It's called Bedtime Stories, and it's like the most epic storytelling. And my goodness, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, you will be a fan of Bedtime Stories. They cover strange, crazy stories as well, and it's just masterfully done. But I'm not here today just to tell you how great Bedtime Stories is. I'm here today because I have an announcement. Bedtime Stories is starting a podcast, and it's going to fall under the Ballin Studios banner. We're working together. It's super cool. But here's the even bigger news. Not only is Bedtime Stories a brand new Ballin Studios podcast, it is live right now. New episodes of the Bedtime Stories podcast will air each week on Wednesday, but right now the first 3 episodes of the podcast are available wherever you get your podcasts. So go and mule kick the Bedtime Stories follow button right in the solar plexus and get hooked on them just like I did. But first, check out this clip from the trailer for Bedtime Stories.
Turn off the lights, get into bed, and turn up the volume. It's time for a creepy bedtime story. From Ballin Studios, welcome to Bedtime Stories, a new weekly show that will truly immerse you in a strange, dark, and mysterious world and haunt your dreams. We'll bring you true stories from around the world, from the paranormal to the supernatural, unsolved mysteries, strange deaths, cryptids, and the most disturbing of true crime, all told in a unique and bone-chilling way. New episodes every Wednesday. Follow Bedtime Stories wherever you get your podcasts. Bedtime Stories.
On a sunny afternoon in October of 2015, a 39-year-old man named Richard Jones walked along the perimeter of the yard inside of the state prison in Kansas, where Richard was serving time for a robbery. Up ahead, Richard could see there was a small basketball court with one hoop on it, and on the blacktop were dozens of other inmates that were exercising and chatting and socializing, and Richard actually knew most of them because he had been in prison for 16 years now, and Richard was also a very likable guy who was very outgoing and personable, and so he made friends really easily, even in prison. And so as Richard continued his walk in the direction of the basketball court, he saw one of the guys on the blacktop broke free from the group and began moving towards Richard. And Richard immediately recognized who it was. It was his good friend, Steve. And Richard was about to give him a friendly wave when he noticed Steve looked really mad. And so Richard actually just stopped and stared at Steve as he slowly approached him. And as he got closer, Richard could see Steve's fists were balled up and his face was in a scowl. I mean, Steve looked like he was coming over to fight Richard. And so when Steve got about 10 feet away from Richard, Richard actually spoke up before Steve could say anything. And he said, "Steve, what's going on? Why are you so upset?" Steve was kind of a hothead, and Richard knew that. But a lot of times, even when he got mad about things, it would blow over really quickly. And so this was kind of routine, but Richard just couldn't think of a reason for why Steve would be mad at him. And so Steve walks right up to Richard and he goes, "Oh, so now you want to talk to me?" Richard was immediately confused and kind of turned his head sideways and was like, "What?" Steve stared at Richard, kind of expecting Richard to eventually apologize or something, but eventually he noticed that Richard really was not sure what he was talking about. And so Steve was like, "This morning, I went up to you at the cafeteria line, I tried to talk to you, and you completely blew me off and walked away in front of a big group of people. That really embarrassed me and made me look bad." And Richard was like, "I have no idea what you're talking about. I didn't even see you this morning. I don't know where this is coming from." Steve was not buying it, and he was like, "Richard, I know it was you. I saw you this morning. I spoke to you this morning. You did that." And Richard was like, "No, really, Steve, I'm sorry. I have no idea what this is about." And so these two continued to go back and forth on this. And then at some point, they both kind of noticed that they were drawing lots of attention because they are in prison and any sort of confrontation immediately draws eyeballs. And so when they noticed other inmates were kind of beginning to walk over to see what was going on, and the guards were starting to notice, Steve just said, "You know what, Richard, fine. I guess I must have made a mistake. No big deal." And he turned and he ran back to the basketball court. After Steve had left, Richard continued his walk around the perimeter, but that exchange with Steve had really weirded him out because this was actually not the first time something like this had happened. It all started a month ago when an inmate that Richard didn't know came up to him like he definitely knew him and said to Richard, "Hey, how's your grandmother? I heard she fell down, is she okay?" And at first Richard was like, "Wait a minute, is my grandmother okay? Did she fall?" But then Richard eventually realized that this inmate thought Richard was someone that he wasn't. Now, at first, Richard thought this was just kind of like a weird one-off event. But every few days after this first time, something else would happen. Either an inmate who Richard didn't know would come up to him and be really friendly with him, as if they knew Richard, but Richard clearly didn't know them. Or someone Richard did know would come up to him and accuse him of odd behavior that Richard couldn't remember doing. Like the interaction he had with Steve, when Steve came up and said, "You snubbed me in the lunchroom." And so after Richard's interaction with Steve, Richard began to think, wait a minute, is someone screwing with me? Is that what's been going on? The next morning during breakfast, Richard decided not to sit where he normally did, and instead he sat on the very far side in the corner of the cafeteria to basically just be able to people watch all the people inside the cafeteria. And then that afternoon, when Richard was outside, instead of walking around the perimeter like he liked to do, he just sat in a central location and just constantly scanned the whole yard. Now, Richard didn't really know what he was actually looking for. He just figured, maybe I'll see something suspicious, I'll see someone staring at me for too long, or I'll see someone I don't know talking to my friends. Something will tip me off to what's been going on for the past couple of weeks. But despite all this careful people watching he was doing, Richard didn't see anything suspicious. Until 1 week after the interaction Richard had with Steve about snubbing him in the lunch line, Richard was sitting in the cafeteria again when he noticed something very strange on the other side of the cafeteria. And when he saw it, he just stood up and stared, and he felt his heart starting to race faster, and he felt his breath speeding up. And Steve actually was sitting next to him and said, "Hey, Richard, what's going on?" And Richard couldn't even find the words. He just raised his arm up and pointed to the other side of the room. When Richard had originally been arrested 16 years earlier, it was for robbing someone in a Walmart parking lot. Richard had always claimed he did not do it, but multiple witnesses had pulled Richard out of a lineup saying that's the guy. And the woman who actually got robbed told police she overheard the getaway driver yelling to Rick, the man who had robbed her, to get in the car so they could leave. And Rick is a nickname for Richard. Richard had insisted he was at a barbecue in another state at the time of this robbery, and so it really couldn't have been him. But the evidence was just overwhelming, and so eventually he was convicted. Richard had never been able to understand why so many people 16 years earlier had insisted that he was the one who committed that crime. And more recently, he couldn't understand why his friends, like Steve, were accusing him of doing things that he didn't remember doing. But that night in the jail cafeteria, when Richard spotted something on the other side of the room, suddenly everything over the last 16 years made perfect sense. Richard really was an innocent man. He did not rob that woman in the Walmart parking lot. His doppelganger had. A doppelganger is someone who looks exactly like you, but they're not actually related to you. It's just genetic chance that somebody else on the planet looks just like you. And it just so happened that Richard's doppelganger, who was this man named Ricky Amos, so it just so happened as well that the doppelganger shared basically the same first name, Ricky and Richard. Well, this doppelganger, Ricky, just happened to be sent to the same prison that Richard was at for a totally unrelated crime. These two men have never met, there's no connection whatsoever, they just look the same. And when Richard looked across the cafeteria and saw Ricky, it was like looking at a clone of himself, and it all clicked. All the people that were coming up to him saying, "You were doing this and acting weird," well, those people, Stephen included, were actually interacting with his doppelganger, Ricky. And 16 years earlier, Ricky was the one who committed that robbery in Walmart, and the victim and the witnesses, they all confused Ricky for Richard. Here are Richard and Ricky's photographs side by side. Once a judge was made aware of this situation and saw the two photos side by side, he knew the police had made a mistake. Even the prosecutor who had tried Richard in the robbery case supported his release. Richard was freed in 2017 and got a $1 million settlement from the state. As for the doppelganger, Ricky Amos, he was never actually tried for the robbery 16 years earlier because by the time they figured out he was the robber, the case was too old to try. On the evening of March 15th, 2018, a 55-year-old man named Gian stumbled out of this fine dining restaurant in downtown Singapore and promptly threw up on the sidewalk. Pedestrians jumped back to get out of the way, and a woman in high heels and a beautiful fancy dress mumbled something insulting about how drunk Gian must be. But Gian was not drunk. He was totally sober, and now he was absolutely mortified. Gian was actually a businessman who was attempting to impress his clients at dinner, but as he had been sitting at the table with his clients, he had started to feel this pressure in his chest that became so intense that at some point he just had to get up and run outside and vomit. And so after Gian had stood up and wiped his mouth, he thought, now that he had been sick and grown up, that he would feel better. But as he was standing there, he noticed the pressure in his chest had not been relieved at all. And so, as much as Gian wanted to stick around and talk more with his clients, he felt like the only thing he could do now was to go in and politely excuse himself for the rest of the night and just go home and sleep off whatever was going on with him. But when Gian went back into the restaurant and was actually back at his table, before he could even say a sentence to his clients explaining the situation, he was turning around and running back outside and vomiting on the street again. At this point, Gian knew something was definitely wrong. And so he didn't have time to tell his clients what was going on. He just needed to get to a hospital. And so he sprinted across the street, got in his car, and began driving. When he got to the hospital, he was so scared about what was happening to him that he actually parked his car crooked in the spot and left his door open as he sprinted towards the emergency room. And then once he was inside the hospital, he ran up to the receptionist and tried to tell them what was going on, but he literally couldn't speak. And then he just collapsed in a chair right nearby. Now, the hospital was extremely busy, but all the nurses could tell whatever was going on with this man, it could not wait. And so they ran over to him, they lifted him up, they put him on a stretcher, and they wheeled him into a private exam room. And then once he was in there, they began taking his vitals, and also they began assessing him, looking for some sort of trauma on the outside of his body that could explain what was going on with him, but they couldn't find anything. And so after they were sure that Gian was stable, he was breathing okay, his heart rate was okay, he just couldn't speak, but he was going to be okay, the team decided that the next thing they should do would be to give him a CT scan. A CT scan is a specialized type of imaging that can show what's going on inside someone's body. It's like a really detailed x-ray. And after they gave Gian a CT scan, his results were baffling. There was this solid, fairly large, white object that was lodged at the base of Gian's esophagus. Your esophagus sits below your throat and above your stomach. It's basically the tube that food goes through to get to your stomach. But whatever was stuck inside of Gian's esophagus was not something that looked like food. It actually kind of looked like a human hand. Now, the doctors had no idea what this thing was. And you gotta remember that they really don't have much information here. All they know is this middle-aged guy who's dressed really well has come running into the hospital, he can't speak, and he's collapsed. And here we are. He has this obstruction in his esophagus. And so even though the doctors really had no idea what they were dealing with, what they knew is they had to get this foreign object out of Gian. So they wheeled Gian into the operating room for emergency surgery, and then at some point a doctor came in with this long skinny tube that had a camera at the top of it. Their first step for this operation was putting this camera down into Gian to see what this thing was that was stuck inside of his esophagus. And so after Gian was prepped for surgery, the doctor with this camera began snaking it down Gian's throat until finally the camera could actually see this white object in his esophagus. And when the camera revealed what this thing was, the entire medical team in the operating room just gasped. They could not believe what they were looking at. To understand what they were looking at, we have to go back several hours. That night, Gian had decided he really wanted to impress his wealthy clients. And so he had decided to take them to this very special restaurant that none of them had been to, and he wanted them to try a very special and very rare dish that this restaurant sold. It was called sanakji. Sanakji is a Korean delicacy that is very popular in certain circles. But it's also very dangerous. Every year in South Korea, at least 6 people die from eating sanakji. Because sanakji is just a living octopus. You literally eat the octopus as it's moving around, and the risk of it getting stuck in your throat is pretty high. And so as Gian is trying to eat this living octopus, the octopus decided it didn't want to be eaten, and so it flailed its tentacles around, and finally its suckers lodged onto his esophagus, and that's where it stopped. Now, we don't know how long this octopus remained alive inside of Gian's esophagus, but we know it was alive at least for a little bit, because after Gian managed to swallow it down, it kept wriggling around and grabbing and trying to escape, and that's what created that intense pressure in Gian's chest and kept causing him to go vomit. And so when the doctors put that camera down Gian's throat, they saw a whole octopus. The octopus was removed from Gian's esophagus, and 2 days later, Gian was discharged, fully recovered. It's unclear if Gian ever tried sanakji again. At 4 a.m. on a winter day in 1993, a 50-year-old man named Joe walked down a dark hallway inside of his farmhouse in Kentucky. As he moved, he did his best to be as quiet as possible so as not to wake up his wife or son, who were sleeping nearby. But when Joe got about halfway down the hall, he happened to look inside the family room, and he thought he saw something moving. He strained his eyes to see who it was, thinking maybe it was his wife or son who had gotten up for some reason, but he just couldn't tell. However, as Joe stared into the darkness, he heard the sound of floorboards creaking inside the family room, and then before Joe could do anything, the thing he had seen moving was now rushing straight towards him. Hours later, Kentucky State Police would arrive at Joe's house, and what they would discover there was a monstrous crime that literally had never been committed before in this part of Kentucky. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's stories and you want more content like it, be sure to check out our podcast called the Mr. Ballin Podcast, where we have literally hundreds more stories just like these that are available to listen to right now. That podcast is called the Mr. Ballin Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music.
Welcome to Mysterious Universe, Season 30, Episode 12. Coming up on this show, we've got the druidic antennas of power, throwing down the psychic gauntlet, and MI5's heart attack monsters. I'm your host, Benjamin Grundy. Joining me is Aaron Wright.
What are these druidic antennas?
I went down a massive rabbit hole today. Remember the last show we were talking about Bibu's new banger?
Oh yeah, it was definitely a banger.
Where he was looking at this discovery from ancient Assyria, this black obelisk from King... What was his name? Shebenezar or something
like that.
Some ancient king, some ancient Assyrian king from like 9,000 years ago. And on this black obelisk were panels of what the king was given in, I guess...
as a gift.
As gifts from the other submissive kings. And one of the big things that biblical scholars enjoy is that one of the kings from the Old Testament is actually depicted nude, like he's bending down, prostrating to this new king of Assyria. But Bibu noticed in one of the panels there were these weird hybrids.
Chimeric beings.
These chimeric hybrid creatures that were given to the king as a kind of, as a gift. And Bibu went into this whole, epic line of research, questioning whether there were actually these chimeric...
ancient advanced genetic engineering.
Which we've got into before in previous episodes. We've spoken about all these so-called Atlantis channelers, whether it's Edgar Casey or Barbara Handclough, that claim they have these past life visions of these weird hybrids, like strange people with scales and all sorts of twisted creations that existed in some ancient civilization.
So how could you build upon that?
Well, I was looking at one of these sources I had in this research, and it was over at this website called enfolding.org, which is run by Phil Hine, and he mostly writes about tantrism. But he was writing about some of these ancient theories of the Aryan invasion, the whole idea that there was a population that invaded India, 5,000-6,000 years ago. And this resulted in basically two peoples in India. There were the lighter-skinned Aryans and there was the Dravidians, which had the darker skin. And this has been a hugely controversial topic for a very long time. And it's very hard to talk about it because it's such a loaded thing to talk about race and the history of India. And I love this guy, Phil Hine's take on it, because he just goes through the history of how this thinking evolved, where the idea of Aryans came from. Like you think of Aryans today, and
immediately you go to the Third Reich.
You think of the Third Reich, you think of Nazis, you think of, I guess, Nordic-looking blondes with blue eyes and blonde hair, and the idea of Hyperborea and some land in the north where the Aryans came from. But the history of the idea of Aryans is a linguistic history. It actually comes from language. And the author here, Phil Hine, he's done a bunch of articles on how you can trace this back to thinkers in the 18th century, the 19th century. We mentioned one of these guys on the last show, this incredibly gifted, philologist who was knighted and then sent to India to be a judge. He was stationed in Bengal. Sir William Jones was his name. And immediately he's like, I've got to learn Sanskrit. So he spends a year or two learning Sanskrit, totally masters it. And he gives a presentation to the Asiatic Society at the time and says, I've made a huge discovery. It turns out that ancient Greek and Latin and Sanskrit come from the same language.
Gucci
They're
fan.
all connected. They all have the same roots. It's
Yo,
undeniable.
homie, what's up?
And this totally upends
How's
this
it going?
idea that all the language, and this was the idea at the time, all
Chillin'.
these languages came from Hebrew.
Yeah.
Ain't some
The idea that everything
Diablo.
came from Adam and Eve and everything had to have come from
All
Hebrew.
messages sent in
And
our
so
chat
this
must
started
adhere
this
to Kicks
rethinking
community
in the
guidelines.
West
Community
of
get aligned
where
safe
the
chatting.
cradle of civilization might actually be. And for a long time, it was India. People said, that many, even Voltaire at the time said, clearly India is the cradle of civilization.
So this is clearly being, discovered or, discussed well before the out of Africa theory, and certainly before the out of Australia
So
theory.
that-
Yeah, I mean, this is separate to that. This is the origin of
Doing my
civilization
good morning
rather
then putting
than
D3i
as
and then record
evolution.
when
This
you're
is about
ready to
evolution.
jam.
All right, cool.
But
yeah,
as this
I'll get on there.
this research continued, there was a bit of a shift where it kind of went from this India mania where everyone loved India and India is the cradle of the civilization. And then it shifted to, like, once the race scientists got involved, they were like, well, clearly it was the Aryans that created this civilization. And they're actually these white people, and then they linked it to race, and then the Germans loved the idea.
course they
And then
did,
there's
yeah.
this whole kind of history of where the meme came from, right? But it's all based on language. And so I started digging into this, and then I found this really obscure, like, side path in all of this. In the early 1800s, when this was all being discovered, this India mania was really at the forefront of intellectual questioning in the 19th century. There were some really notable scholars that said, hang on a second, this is all the same things, this is the same stuff we see in the Celts. And clearly the Celts are connected to ancient India. The Vedic gods are the same as the Celtic gods. Some of the practices are the same. The language is the same. And I thought, what is going on here? So I started to dig into this. And this is where I got into this concept of the Celtic towers. You know, the towers, the stone towers in
Yes.
Ireland?
Yep.
And I'll bring up, have I got an image of one here? You know, many of you will probably recognize these kind of things.
Yeah, I think I looked into what was it? It wasn't electromagnetic, but there was something about, was it sun's rays or something? There's something strange about this. When you hold up a radio frequency transceiver next to
Yeah.
it, it behaves in a funny way.
There's all this questioning about what their purpose was.
But inside they're hollow, aren't they?
Yeah, they're hollow. And the weird thing about them is I don't know if I've got one. Yeah, the doors are not at ground level. Like, the entryways are not at ground level. They're always kind of halfway up the tower, and there's always been this question of what they're for. The conventional answer is they were for defense. But this is quickly overturned because they're useless at defense. I mean, you could just throw one, fire arrow in there and whoever's in there would be smoked out almost instantly. There's not enough space in there to store food for a siege. They're maybe for a lookout tower, but then really not defensive. So people have been trying to figure out for a long time what they're for. And coming up in the PLUS extension, as I dug into this and followed this path of research, I discovered that there's this line of thinking that they are from the Druids, these things. But there's a connection between the Druids and ancient India.
Really?
And it's got to do with a science of the ancient world that has long been forgotten. And
Some type of Germanic science?
Yeah, it connects these towers in Ireland. It connects pyramids across the world. And ultimately, it's tied to Egypt and ancient India.
Interesting.
So that's going to be revealed. It's like a massive rabbit hole.
It sounds a little bit
That's
Bruce Cathy.
started with weird like race science from the 1800s and ended up going into these weird stone
Start
towers.
with eugenics and just see how you end up.
Yeah, that's how I approach
Sure.
most shows.
That's a fantastic idea. That's great.
What did
All right.
you uncover today?
Well, after we did that work on describing what was not our work, but what Bibu described with the chimeric beings, I thought I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into some of the folklore and to see how much of that folklore kind of has moved into our modern times. And of course, it has. We talk about these, really what are chimeric style beasts, and that would be werewolves, Bigfoot sometimes, because sometimes Bigfoot is portrayed as being almost man-like. There's mule people that are coming up.
Mule people.
There seems to be this combination, this recombination between animal and human, and it pops up a lot. But
Like donkey men.
donkey men. Well, in this particular case, it's a mule woman. But I'll get back to that in a moment. So it's definitely equal opportunity when it comes to these beings. So with these, this in mind, I actually picked up a copy of Werewolf Stories, Shapeshifters, Lycanthropes, and Man Beasts: The Real Unexplained Collection by Nick Redfern and Brad Steiger. And the reason why I really enjoyed this book, we always like Nick's work, and I'm a real big fan of Brad Steiger. But the reason
This
why
is new? No, this must be old because Brad Steiger's not
Brad
with us.
Steiger's, he died 2 or 3 years ago
When
now.
did this come out?
So it's this came out just on the 12th of September. So it must be just collections of, because there is, and this is why this book is really great, because it's not just a collection of old tales, even though there's plenty of those in there, which are just great and ripe for the picking. It's a collection of stories of people that have spoken directly to Brad Steiger and have explained their experiences, really
Also,
boots
it's not
on
just
the ground kind
It's not
of
just
stuff.
folklore. It's modern, contemporary
modern.
sightings.
Very much so. And this stuff is continue. And then it starts tying into things like British intelligence using monsters.
Yeah, I've noticed your
strange.
headline has MI5. What's MI5's
Well, I don't know-
heart attack?
I don't know if it's MI5 specifically, but according to a source connected to some of these stories, he reckons that it's British intelligence had used monsters to kill people.
What?
Yeah. You've got people trying to summon the beasts of Aleister Crowley that end up being strange werewolf-like creatures. You've got all these stories, a lot of these stories that we know, but with these whole new angles on them. It's really quite intriguing.
So there's like a James Bond movie waiting to be created where instead of being this, really capable spy, he just turns into a werewolf and starts killing his enemies.
Well,
Is that what it is?
They don't particularly turn into werewolves, but they use rituals to summon entities, to utilize them to cause trouble. And that will all become
I love
apparent.
this idea that instead of just using a gun, you do this elaborate
That's
occult
exactly what
ritual.
he says. This is exactly what he says. He says that it's too obvious if you use a gun, or although in saying that, where you can go, this is a little bit ridiculous, is that we know that intelligence agencies, particularly from the US, they've spent huge amounts of black budget money creating, weapons that can kill people without leaving a trace, and poisons and toxins and all that kind of stuff. So. Is it that much of a stretch to think that they may engage in occult activities to be able to?
Yes, it
kill
is.
a-
That much
I don't
of
think
a
it is
stretch.
at all. I don't
Yes,
think
it
it is at all. I really don't. But that will become apparent as we go into these stories. So let's just jump straight into the book, because I'm looking forward to getting into your Plus extension later on, Ben. But I've got to start off. You may be familiar with this story, but I've got to highlight this because this kind of demonstrates what happens to a lot of people in this field. And, Nick points out that when he was in, I think it was when he was still living in Britain, it's 2002, it's about 4 o'clock in the morning, and Nick wakes up to a presence in the house. Like he just has this feeling, he knows that there's something in the house. And of course, naturally you'll want to go and check on what it is. But as he goes to get out of bed, he realizes that he can't move. He's completely paralyzed. And obviously, even back in 2012, he's knowledgeable about things like sleep paralysis and the old hag. And I can only begin to imagine what was going through his mind. And as he's laying there, he says this beast, this huge, hulking wolf man of a beast, that's the only way to describe it, walks through the bedroom door, but it's wearing a cape. Like it's wearing this long black cape. It's got these fiery red eyes. And he says it seems like it's pissed off. Like it's pissed off about something, and he doesn't know what.
And he's wide awake. This isn't.
He's not. He's absolutely wide awake. He says he's half awake, but he knows that he's not dreaming. And as he's lying there and he's paralyzed and he's trying to get through this hulking thing is standing over the bed. And you can go, yeah, look, this is one of those hypnagogic events that people experience, and Nick does a lot of this research. So now, no doubt, somehow this is
at Breathe Out Crypto Guy.
being
Please
created in
follow
his
me on
mind,
Twitter
and
at
it's some
Twitter
weird
Jane
mind
Mary
matter
80
thing.
and Twitter at
explanations
Twitter
for it,
Jane
but it
Mary
never
80.
covers
Never.
everything that happens with the phenomenon. It doesn't explain everything that goes on.
Yeah, and I totally agree with Nick. He points out, quite rightly so, that he's like, I believe that this is not some type of weird mind matter, that there are these external entities that are somehow invading into people's worlds. They're coming into their bedrooms. And because Nick's looking into this stuff and it's pissed off. And he says he tries to move, and this is what we hear in a lot of the sleep paralysis experiences, though, is that when a person is experiencing sleep paralysis, if they push hard enough with all of their might or their mental might, if they can just move anything just slightly, like just make their pinky kind of move, they'll break the spell. And he said that's exactly what happened. He said this thing just kind of shuffled out of the room and was gone, and he broke the spell and was able to jump up and look to see what this thing was. And of course, there was nothing there. But in saying that, he said that the house for at least 3 days was left with this foreboding, angry atmosphere that was there. And I thought, this is intriguing. You've got a man who is researching these stories, and it's almost like he's getting a warning. It's not as far as the Men in Black experiences, although I do have something similar to that coming up with beings appearing in Men in Black style experiences, but it's almost like he had stumbled onto something that the phenomenon doesn't want people to know. And when it comes down to these stories of werewolves, especially with the more modern stories, it appears to be that it could be some type of occult knowledge where people are actually shape-shifting using these occult practices. And so did he stumble across something that he was going to blow the lid on, and this thing got ticked off? And I'm not saying necessarily that it's the intelligence itself that sent it after him. Was it a group?
Maybe it was MI5.
Well, maybe.
It was an MI5 agent.
Maybe. So let's start with the bridge and the shapeshifters. And I'll bring up this first image for me here, Ben. So in this particular image here, and I'll just get the exact details. This is from Elm Creek. So this is Elm Creek in San Antonio in Texas. And this has a really fascinating history behind it. So there's a lot of stories that have been changed over the years, and there's different kind of versions of this story that are out there. And it's really morbid. It's really quite horrible. But Nick has really given the most succinct, I think, story out of all the ones I looked into today that describes this incredible experience that people allegedly have with the donkey woman or the mule woman of this bridge. Now, fascinatingly enough, if you're familiar with some of these stories, you notice that these entities, these strange entities that always seem to be on the outskirts of cryptozoology and high strangeness, show up at bridges. You've got, the mystical man monkey of the Shropshire Canal.
Yeah.
You've got
Classic.
Yeah, classic story of like a ghost ape-like thing that comes along and attacks a guy, and he hits it with his whip, and then the whip goes straight through it. You're absolutely right, Ben. Classic story. But with this mule story, it goes back to the late 19th century, and it relates to a young family that lived not too far from this bridge. And this family encompassed a man and a woman and 2 children. And everything was pretty good. I mean, they lived a simple life and things were fine. And as they're living their life, there apparently was this local tyrant. He was the son of a wealthy merchant or something like that, someone with a bit of power. And clearly this child had been raised in a bad way. And he was a young man by now, but he was essentially evil. He was just a sociopath. He would quite happily beat animals whenever he saw them, even killing them in some of the reports. And on this particular day, he had been going past their homestead, this family's homestead. And as he goes past, he sees a mule just sitting outside, just happily eating grass, doing what it does. And for whatever twisted and sick reason, he gets out of his vehicle or whatever he's going along in and runs over and starts beating up this mule. Like, why would you do that? Like, just starts punching up this mule.
Yeah.
And the mule starts reacting. Like, it reacts as you expect it would. And they come running outside, the man and the woman. And as they run outside, they try to stop him. And as they try to stop him, they can't, and he's just wailing down on this donkey, so they start throwing stones at him. And these stones hit him and injure him and piss him off. And so because he's pissed off, he kind of turns around and says to them something along the lines of, I'm going to make you pay for this, and you don't know who I am and who my father is, and this is going to be a big problem for you. So he goes away, and they think, obviously they're concerned, but don't think too much else of it because they don't take any precautions or steps. But sadly, and this is a really horror part of the story, is that they wake up to find their little homestead alight, later that evening.
For what?
And this thug had hired some goons to come over and set fire to their homestead. And sadly,
I'm not fucking giving them any more
the
money.
fire engulfed the homestead so rapidly that only they were able to get out, and the two
They're
children
not getting
sadly
any more of
perished
my
in the
money.
fire.
That's
Far out.
it.
It's
I'll play that
horrible.
game
Like,
if I'm fucking bored.
Absolutely horrible, but I think it's an important element of these stories because, like many of these stories that involve...
I'm
it's
gonna
like
fucking wait out
passion
for
or
Path of Exile
anger
2.
or grief. There's these strong
That's-
human emotions that seemingly play a role in many of these stories of people shape-shifting or seemingly possessing the ability to possess animals and control them. And this pops up in other
I also
elements
got-
of the paranormal as well, but these extremely strong
Yeah,
emotions
like I also
play
want
a
to
great
fucking play
deal,
Baldur's Gate. I
in
haven't
these
touched that game in a hot
experiences.
minute.
And so the story goes is that sadly, the mother, so the father also was badly burnt, but the two of them managed to get out.
I know. I'm
When
waiting
is
for
this again?
that.
This is
the
kind
late
of
19th
to
century.
play,
Okay.
'cause
So he
I'm
manages
just
to
gonna
get
put it by myself.
outside.
It's all right.
This is the father and collapses. Like he was so severely burnt that he only lives for a few moments, and
the game.
sadly he passes
I
away.
prefer to play with like
but
people.
the goons are still around. And they're, attacking, and she manages to flee, but she's burnt. She must have, 90% burns to her body. It's something horrific. But she manages to flee down to this bridge, that very bridge that I showed you before, Ben. And she falls into the water. Her body's never found. It's
Good,
never
good.
recovered. No one ever knows what
I
happened
just
to
gotta
her.
get some,
The story gets out that very
fucking
soon afterwards,
gems and
people
shit that
start
I need to-
encountering a half mule,
Hold on.
half woman beast.
I'm still
along
missing the
this
two.
bridge. Yeah, I mean, probably not that to that point.
Do you know how hard it is to find a decent, safe for work image
I don't think so.
of the mule woman on the internet?
That is actually a good question.
And
I'd
we
imagine
have-
it'd be quite difficult.
This looks like a Rob Morphy image. He's probably sketched this. They're hard to find. There's
maybe.
another one there, Donkey Lady Lives, San Antonio, Texas.
Yeah, they're all a little bit sensationalized. From the reports that I was reading, is that it's just essentially exactly what you would imagine a half mule, half woman to look like. It's a farm.
Now, which half is she like a centaur? So it's like a
No,
woman's
it's not
body.
half and half. It's like what I said about those chimeric beings, where it's like a recombination of the genes or whatever it is.
It's just like a
gene.
It's just like a donkey with a woman's head.
Kind of. Yeah, kind of. And she appears.
Is there others or
infrequently.
boobs?
Well, I didn't go that far, and we'll have to ask Nick to find out whether or not what's going on there. But this sets the scene for many of these types of stories, right? And this kind of continues throughout this book, and I thought this to be intriguing because Brad Steiger ended up making friends with a number of Navajo people, and they start describing their stories as well. And what I really like about this is that when people talk about they're from a more traditional or indigenous stance, you kind of get people going, oh, well, then, that's part of their culture. So you just kind of accept it, right? Like straight away, you're like, oh, well, because they're indigenous, they're more spiritual.
It's funny. I was thinking about that this morning while I was driving to work.
Really?
Funny you say that because I was thinking, right now there's all this debate about, Aboriginals in Australia and
just I'm
people
doing, like,
look at their
just
culture and
bunch of
say, look at the
mystery
amazing
stories
culture
and
and they've
fucking
got this connection with the
paranormal shit.
land and the spirits of
Throwing
the
that on
land.
there today.
And, the people accept it, like you're saying. Like, that's their culture, it's traditional, they accept it. But he asked someone, like, what do you think of fairies? What do you think of elves?
This right now, what
It's
I'm
like,
listening to is the Mysterious Universe.
Right.
They talk about all
Yeah,
sorts of
that's-
crazy
that's
shit.
Great
That's
point.
our culture.
Yeah, so, yep, you're
They're
totally
our
right.
creatures.
Every single culture has these folkloric beings that pop up, right? And yes, even though because, I guess the European culture has kind of moved away. But you know what? And what's pointed out with these Navajo stories is so have they. Like one of the witnesses
course.
that speaks to Brad Steiger, he's like, I didn't believe in any of this. I didn't believe in it. And yet he has one of these experiences. And I think that's actually more compelling as being an event that I believe took place because you have someone who is going, I don't believe in it, but I had the experience. It's like that's more telling rather than, well, you could say from a skeptical standpoint, it's part of, someone's folklore. So that's what they're going to see when they have these experiences.
So what, this mule woman, did she attack anyone? Or did she
No,
just seeing?
people see her apparently.
Is
but
there any
obviously
evidence that the tragedy actually happened, or it's just an urban legend?
It's kind of an urban legend, and as I said, the story has morphed over the years, so whether or not how true it is, I really don't know. But it sets the scene, though, of it being, this is a folkloric legend that exists, right, within our culture. So with the stories from the Navajo, it's, the second one actually is what was described to Brad Steiger. Let me just bring it up here for you. So there was this young man that was, where was he living? I think it was somewhere. His wife apparently had converted to Roman Catholicism or something like that. So again, another step away from what you would expect to be their traditional
I'm just
beliefs.
trying to move up one by one.
And sorry, it was a sister, right? And so she was saying, look, my brother had this experience
So
heading
it's
to
like-
our grandmother's home, many
If I
years
feel
ago, and this
comfortable,
was
I'll move
described
up
to
another
Brad's
corner.
tiger. And, obviously Brad, wanted to know more about it. And she said, well, look, my brother was hitchhiking, and it was late one evening, and he ended up getting out of the vehicle at one point because the vehicle was going in the opposite direction to our grandmother's house. And so he's wandering along. It's really, really late, and he comes up to a bus stop. When he comes to this bus stop, he's like, it's still 50 miles to our grandmother's house, my grandmother's house. I might just stay here. It's getting cold. I can just bunk.
Another 50 miles.
Yeah, another 50 miles of walking.
Oh my
And
god.
no one's coming along, right? It's late at night. It's dark. Well, he's hitchhiked to this point. And then he's like, well, because the other car went the other direction, what else can he do? So he decides to hunker down for the evening. And he says, as he hunkers down for the evening, he sees this animal that he thinks is a big dog. He just looks, it's like, oh, it's a big dog. And wanting some company for the evening, he starts whistling to it and like clicking his fingers.
Right.
So he whistles and clicks his fingers, and this thing comes running up to him. But as it comes running up to him, it gets up onto its hind legs. And he's doing the same thing. He's kind of pulling back, going, what the hell am I seeing? He was terrified. He was absolutely terrified. And it says here
It's a horny donkey lady.
well, no, not quite. He's like, is it a big dog? Was it a big coyote? It doesn't really matter because it had a man's face.
What?
It had a man's face. So much like what you said about the donkey lady, it was a man's face on a large coyote or large dog
So
body.
it was still a dog body.
Still a dog body, but a man's face.
Wasn't a man wearing skins?
No. It was definitely like he was insistent that this was some type of.
See, this isn't even a werewolf. Like a
It's
werewolf
like a centauric creature.
is meant to have a wolf-like head.
Right. Yeah,
and,
yeah.
And like those Linda Gottfried style reports,
It's actually like a wolf man.
eyewitnesses describe a dog,
Yeah.
wolf-shaped head. What is this?
Well, this is part of the greater, I guess, fauna of shapeshifters. Like, because they're never quite right. There's obviously, like, when you look at it as a human being, you go, how the hell is that there? How does that exist? It can't exist in nature because it's not natural. It's supernatural. But in the way that it's created, I don't know. But I mean, he said that also the face was painted with little white dots, which kind of indicated maybe that this was part of a ritual that had been performed. And later on, he found out, and he says, look, I never believed in such creatures until that moment. But then some medicine people had told me that they really do have the power to travel long distances as a wolf or a coyote.
So it's like a skinwalker again.
It's a skinwalker, but it was using it to travel along. It just comes up to this guy. Now, he said he went to his grandmother and, he got there. He immediately took off to his grandmother's place, walked the 50 miles.
Did this thing just...
This thing just took off in the opposite direction. It was gone. Like, no threat. And this is one thing that does come up a lot in these...
You didn't have any sausages in his pockets?
No, nothing like that. Like, this thing just was
Give
gone.
it some kibble?
Yeah. And that's why if you're hitchhiking, carry some kibble. Kibble and bits, you'd be fine for the shapeshifters. So, he went and told his grandmother, and his grandmother was just like, she wanted to sing it away. There was like a ritual of singing it away because there was a belief that there was potential for evil here. And this is something that was repeated by Manuel. So Manuel was also a Navajo man who described his experiences to Brad Steiger. And he said that his grandfather, his name was Esteban, had an experience back in 1909. So Esteban was only a 15-year-old young man, and he was like a sheep herder, that kind of thing. And this was apparently it wasn't too far from the Arizona-New Mexico border. And he said apparently he would stop at this small hut that wasn't too far from his home. And one particular day as he came to this hut, there were these two beautiful young women that lived there. One was called Isabel and the other one was called Carmelita. And he said they gave him some cool water and they gave him some bread. And it's funny, immediately I start seeing the parallels. And you mentioned, fairy folklore there, Ben. It's the parallels between, English or European folklore and what's happening here, because these just seem to be normal women. But they're giving him water, they're giving him bread, like don't drink the drink, don't eat the food. And he has no reason to think that there's anything odd going on, but they're really attractive. And so what does he do? He goes home, he's a 15-year-old boy, of course his hormones are racing. He sneaks out at night, and he starts repeatedly sneaking out at night to come back to this hut to hang out with these two girls. And he's hanging out with them. It doesn't say exactly
Hanging out
with them, but it doesn't say exactly what else happens, but...
Sitting down playing Scrabble.
Yeah, that's exactly what they're doing. But he said that as he was slipping out at night...
This is a missed opportunity to have some saucy AI images. You need to get onto the Mid-Journey,
I will get onto Mid-Journey. I didn't have time today, but I will. Although he did say that he had exciting company with them, but they also sang songs that he'd never heard anywhere else. And apparently, as they played the guitar, they seemingly were displaying great powers that come along, apparently, with these witches and shapeshifters. But he doesn't worry about this. Like, none of this is on his mind, right? So he cherished these nocturnal hours that he spent with these beautiful sisters, but he always left the hut before midnight. So very Gremlins-esque in this. He's always leaving before midnight so he could get back home before his father, would call on him coming home late from work to check on him. But on this particular evening, he said that it became increasingly difficult to leave because the girls would tempt him to stay after midnight. And they would keep on, obviously offer up a little bit of, nookie and whatever else was going on.
Another game, another round of Scrabble.
Another round of Scrabble, exactly. Until finally, he's like, no, I've got to go. And he went after midnight. Now, nothing happened because it was only moments after, but he got back home and his father was there, and his father was pissed. He was just like, where have you been? You've snuck out of the house. Like, this is extremely foolish. This is a really, dumb thing to do, going and hanging out with these hussies. And he's like, well, I don't care. I'm going to go out. I'm going to go anyway. So he runs.
Did he
away.
start to be physically affected in this story?
It doesn't say that, but I get this feeling there's at least, he's now disobeying his father or disobeying his elders. He's feeling a compulsion to go back to these girls, and he does. It's more so than just a 15-year-old boy. Normally, and because this kid's a sheep herder, it seems quite obvious that he's been raised well and he's behaving, but all of a sudden he goes off the rails when he starts hanging out with these two girls, right?
There's lots of parallels with these stories in fox folklore in Japan
Absolutely.
and China.
Yeah.
Where the local guy comes across a maiden and, he sneaks away at night and he basically spends the night with her. Or in some versions of the stories, the beautiful maiden will sneak into his bedroom at night and they obviously make love. But the family members notice that over time, and this will go on for weeks, he starts to look gaunt, he starts to look drawn,
Draining him.
He becomes pale, he becomes weak. And eventually, in a lot of the stories, he figures it out. He figures out that it's a fox.
Well, this wasn't said directly, but you kind of can infer that it's very similar. And indeed, Nick picks up on that because he does have a chapter or so on the kitsune or the fox spirits of China and Japan, which are the same kind of thing. And of course, what do? They shapeshift. Apparently, their normal form is that of foxes, but they shapeshift into these lovely young women that steal the essence essentially of men and bring down entire civilizations. But with this particular story, he ends up going back to this girl's hut late one evening, and he's knocking on the door, and he's disappointed to discover that there's no one inside. The girls are gone, but there's half a dozen very large cats.
Oh, gross.
Cats, very large though, abnormally large cats. And he's like, this is weird. They begin to yell fiercely at him. These creatures were like homeless strays that had invaded their kitchen in search of food.
Are they like witches' familiars or something? Is that
maybe.
the implication?
Well, he points out that out of frustration and disgust, he actually kicked one of the cats, right? He kicked this cat. And he said the 6 stray animals immediately attacked him. Like, on top of him, he's just being attacked by all these cats. And as these cats are attacking him, he said that he dealt several, deadly kicks, powerful kicks into these creatures, and they're still attacking him. Until finally, as they're on top of him, he leans over behind him, and there's a rock on the floor. He grabs this rock, and he smashes it into the head of one of these cats, and they finally, run away, and they're gone. And he goes home, and he's, beaten up by these 6 massive cats that he's been mauled by. I mean, it's not the equivalent of a Bengal tiger, but pretty close. And he gets home. And of course, the following morning, he goes to call on, Isabel and her sister. And so the door opens, he knocks on the door and the door opens. And rather than being these beautiful young women, it's this angry old woman. And she's like, you're no longer welcome here. And he's like, who the hell are you? And she's wearing this shawl, right? And he's looking, he's trying to understand what he's seeing. And he says her head was bandaged, and it was directly in the spot where he had smashed the cat in the head with the rock. And he realized, he noped the hell out of there because he realized that he said his senses just completely went crazy. He recalled from where this creature had sunk its fangs into his leg that it started pulsing, and it just he knew immediately these were witches.
Yeah, it's like a variation of the old werewolf story where they get shot by a silver bullet or something.
Yes.
And then the next day, a guy in the village has a limp.
Many of those stories, are mentioned in this particular book, so I won't go into that. Although there is actually something similar.
Oh, fellas,
Here we go. Have you
take a
created
look.
something?
Oh, that's the wrong one. Yeah? She spent a bit of time on her donkey ears and her hair. That's a very sexy donkey woman there.
I need that. I need that GIF of the Chinese guy with all the people on top of him. He's like, wood. I'll find it. Put it in the show notes.
Or this one, yeah.
No, I have to go back.
You like
No,
that?
if you're gonna go, you know, like
So you're
Eric
more of an
Biggs.
actual mule face kind of guy. Like Aaron's more of a mule.
I'm more of a personality kind of guy. Okay, I'm
Like
sure
that old question of if you want a mermaid, you know, which half do you want to be the fish? This is like the same question, but
Well, hang on a second. Doesn't that make sense though? Just 1 second. Don't you want the lower part to not be fish? Like, wouldn't that make sense?
yeah, but some guys, it's a hard question for some guys, especially when you're talking about a mule. And clearly you made your decision when I showed those two images, which we'll put in the show notes. Your decision was rapid.
I just prepared. I've been reading this book all day. I've had moments to sit and meditate and contemplate what end of the donkey that I would look at. Anyway, moving back on to, you know, and I like that I, you know, had tried to compare these stories because this book is really well put together in the sense that it kind of follows this flow. But I mixed things up a little bit because you can jump from these stories that come from one culture, one group, on opposite sides of the world, and then you find these parallels. You know, and as you rightly pointed out. So then we come to this story from Dado, which is near Wittenberg in Germany, and this is the story of the wolf strap or the fox strap, and it's a very old story. I think it comes from the late 1800s, maybe even earlier. But the crux of the story is that there apparently lived this woman who was able to take a strap, and it was like a piece. I don't know if it was actually a piece of fox or something, but it was this strap kind of thing. And if you strapped it to yourself, it would allow you to transform into some other type of beast, like a fox-like beast or a wolf-like beast. And so she would use it all the time, and she would use it to stock her larder or her basement full of wild animals. I shouldn't say wild, farm animals. She'd bring in geese and ducks and all this kind of stuff, and chickens, and keep plenty of game downstairs in the basement. And so one day her grandson came along, and he was really fascinated by this and asked if he could bring it to school. And actually, I don't even think he asked. I think he found it in the hiding space and then just took it to school. So he takes it to school, and as it happens, the schoolmaster comes across these kids, chatting about witchcraft and the ability to change things, and he grabbed hold of the fox strap and strapped it to himself in this childlike kind of manner. And it's
What is
claimed.
a fox strap?
So it's like, I don't know if it's an actual piece of strap, but it's an item. It's like an amulet, essentially, which is imbued with some type of magical spell that allows the wearer to take on the form of whatever the item is. So in this case, a wolf or a fox, like it's from the pelt, I believe. And this is what you were describing, Ben, with those stories of...
Is it like a tassel?
I don't know if it's a tassel. It's just more of a strap. Like it's like a belt kind of thing.
If you
can
search
straps for yourself.
image search for fox strap, everything's a bloody sex toy.
Okay, no. It's nothing like that. So immediately the schoolmaster starts transforming before the children into a fox. Like he actually adhered to his flesh and instantly transformed him into a fox, according to the story. So the children began to scream loudly in terror, and it must be earlier than the 1800s. It must be the 1600s where this occurred. But they're running away, and obviously they go and tell their parents. And this mild-mannered, schoolmaster is completely unaware of his transformation, and he becomes frightened and he runs away. But he runs away as a fox, and he runs off into the forest. As he runs off into the forest, these hunters later on go after him. Now, when they go after him, they ended up shooting him. Well, they shoot him, like a group of local sportsmen that, were out there looking for this thing. They shot him. And as they shot him, they found,
is
they
it a
came
real
across, which they
person?
thought at first was a fox, but they came across the body of a naked man with this fox trap lying next to him. And they realized that it was the schoolmaster. So it's like this, I guess those magical stories you hear of, like the leopard people is one example. The lion people come up as well from Africa, stories of shaman, witch doctors being able to transform.
These are folk tales.
These are folk tales.
You said you had contemporary reports. Like
Yes.
stuff that happened yesterday.
Well, not that
A
happened
couple of weeks ago.
Stuff that happened, let's go 20 years ago, but
Okay.
still, quite, I guess, contemporary when we're talking about these types of stories. So I want to bring up the story of Colin Perks, right? And now Colin Perks' story is intriguing. He died prematurely from a heart attack while walking around the fence line of Stonehenge in 2009, right? Now, look, people die of heart attacks all the time, more so these days. But, it's nothing in it, right? Nothing in it. But he was a young, fit man. It didn't make any sense as to why this guy would just suddenly drop dead. And when I say young, he was young for having a heart attack. But for Perks was obsessed with the myth of King Arthur. He became the student of Arthurian lore. And he believed that the stories of King Arthur were actually based upon the exploits and battles of a very real ruler of that name. So he followed clues. He believed that there was a series of complex codes and ciphers, very Da Vinci Code kind of thing, where he could find King Arthur's grave, right? And this all started back, I believe, in the late 1970s when this actually kicked off. And he was on this obsessional mission to find this final resting place. And of course, the location ended up being somewhere in the vicinity of the old English town of Glastonbury.
Hey,
So look how Arthurian that is in itself. I mean, it's beautiful countryside there.
Just go walk 10 meters in any direction, you'd find a sword buried
That's
somewhere.
right. Yeah. Just a knight's armor ready to go. It's around.
An old wand hidden in a tree.
That's right. So he said late one evening, though, and this is what he told to Nick Redfern in September of 2000, he actually spent the day digging in the woods. Like he was convinced that in these woods somewhere, but look, it's such a huge swathe of land. But he managed to get home and he was exhausted and he receives this very weird and what Nick describes as somewhat disturbing phone call. And it's this woman on the other end of the line. And she made it very clear, she was very forceful, that she wanted to discuss with him his situation and his understanding of Arthurian nature. And he was kind of like, yeah, okay, that's fine. And she's like, no, you don't understand. You're not going to, just palm me off. I'm coming to see you and we're going to talk about this. And he's like, okay. And he agrees. Several nights later, he'd arranged a time of 7 p.m. Precisely at 7 p.m., there's this knock at the door, like precisely. And he takes a deep breath and he opens the door, according to Nick. And he was confronted by what can only be described as this, not a donkey in black, a woman in black, right? This is woman in black. She was beautiful, 35 to 40 years of age, dressed in this smart and expensive looking outfit. She had long, full-blooded hair, but her skin was pale and it was smooth, like it was very smooth. And there was this moment of silence because Perks was kind of like just taken back because this is something off. It's almost...
What's off about her?
There's nothing directly, but he just feels like there's something off, right? And, he's captivated, but also intimidated and, in fact, downright frightened by this woman standing at the door. And her face was completely emotionless. Completely.
She's like a robot.
But almost in a way, he said there's this air of hostility that is surrounding her. There's this aura of hostility surrounding her. So he says, okay, come in. And she introduces herself as Sarah Key, which is kind of an odd name when you think about it. It's kind of like if you're going to come up with a name, you kind of like look around, you're like, oh, Sarah Key, that's what she's kind of done.
Sarah Doorknob.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sarah Picture Frame. So she comes in and immediately she wants to know exactly what he and his colleagues have been, getting into, what they know. She insists that she knows everything that he's been doing.
Wait a second, this guy isn't looking into UFOs,
No,
right? He's looking into Arthurian legends.
Yeah, into the legend of King Arthur, right?
What is going on?
And he's taken aback, as you would be. And, he's kind of starts laughing because he becomes defensive and he responds that, look, there's no way that you know what I've been doing or where I've been, and I'm not going to tell you, and you're not going to stop me. Because she's like, you are not to find his burial site. And it's not even a grave. It's this tomb chamber. Like it's this underground chamber, and you're not to go anywhere near it. And he's like,
is he intimidated?
Yeah, he's still intimidated, but he starts to back off because she's like not making these jokes, but he's joking or laughing at her because she's she's so serious that it's absurd. Like it's completely absurd. But then she starts like, on Monday you were at this restaurant, you ate this. On Tuesday you were here, you had this phone call. On Wednesday, and he's like, how the hell do you know that? Like how? So unless these people were following so closely and practically next to him, how is it that they knew this about him? So this is where like the jovial nature just drops off.
Is there any other mention of the weird commonalities we hear in Men in Black stories? Like, is her suit ill-fitting?
No,
She's
nothing.
super pale.
Very super pale is the only thing that comes up, and
So
this
she
air
just-
of hostility.
Otherwise, she just looks like a mean woman in a business suit or something,
but,
right?
But very intimidating, extremely intimidating, which is consistent with these Men in Black stories. So, when she says this stuff and she says, look, it's this chamber and it's no ordinary resting place. In fact, it was built atop And she tells this to him. It was built atop a paranormal gateway or portal to another dimension. And I quote, and it's been, within it dwells a hideous and terrible beast.
Wait, what? Where's this? What?
So she knows where it is, and she's essentially been assigned to stop him from discovering it, because if he discovers it and opens the door, it's going to open up a Crowley portal, basically. And this Crowley portal, all these beasts will come flying out. And
so this is the most dangerous portal in the entire world, and opening it is like Pandora's box.
Pretty much.
And they send a woman in a business suit to just talk to this guy.
Well, no,
like give him an HR reprimand.
Well, I mean, that could be terrifying.
This is your first warning.
But maybe I'm not being too light with it. I mean, he clearly is terrified. And in fact, if you've read Nick's other books, and he's got a full book on Women in Black, they are. It's easy for us to talk about it right now. But actually, in the moment, with this person being at your door and knowing this information about you, it's extremely intimidating.
That's why I'm asking about the other effects. Did he feel this strange fear? He didn't understand where it was from. Did he feel mentally controlled in any way?
That's not said.
Was there a strange vehicle waiting for her that didn't make any sound? You know, those classic stories.
None of that's included, but it does say here, in fact, that her tone became downright menacing and her face turned grim in the extreme. She explained to Perks that if he did not give up his quest, that he would receive yet another visit from HR. No, just yet another visit. But from who or what was not made entirely clear. And now we know this with these Men in Black kind of stories, is that it's just that first experience is enough. But this guy, he's obsessed. He's obsessed. There's no way.
He's not going to let it go, right?
He's not going to let this go, right? So 2 months later, she leaves, and she before she leaves though, she also says, "Look, there are these foul things from strange realms that will enter our world if you keep on dabbling and digging in here. And you might be innocent and earnest in what you're trying to do, but if you do this, it will result in a catastrophe and carnage of a magical consequence that you could never possibly comprehend." Like, it's a big warning.
Calm down.
It's a big warning. So he's like, "Oh yeah, okay, whatever. The woman's gone." But 2 months later, almost to the night, he says it was late, and he has this terrifying encounter. He was driving back to Glastonbury from the city of Bath, and he said this is going through the county of Somerset, which is already connected with strange beasts and beings and other occult activities. And he says suddenly this bizarre figure just materializes on the road ahead of him. Now, this is a small and winding road, so he was only going about 25 miles an hour, even less, if that. And he's able to slam on the brakes, and right in front of him is what can only be described as a gargoyle. It's a gargoyle.
What's going on?
It's this gargoyle. He says it's a tall, man-like figure sporting nothing less than a large pair of bat-style wings and a pair of blazing red eyes. So he's hysterical, as you would be.
Is this the woman in her true form?
Well, he wonders that, but he doesn't wonder that until later on, because the encounter doesn't end here. So he says that he hits the accelerator and this creature just vanishes before his eyes, before he can run it over. And I'm like, you know what? He's a man after my own heart. This is what I would do. If I come across a gargoyle standing in front of me on the road, I'm not going to swerve around and be like, "Oh, I better go around."
You swerve towards it.
Run it over. So he does, but he takes off and this thing just vanishes before his eyes. Now, a week later, not too long after midnight, he was awakened from his sleep by this horrific sight of the gargoyle looming menacingly over his bed. Like, it's in his bedroom, in the middle of the night. He's paralyzed with fear. The creature's gripping his wrists and holding him down and, giving this telepathic message apparently to him to stay away from the woods and to cease looking for King Arthur's chamber. And he's like, "Okay, I'm not going to stop. You're not going to scare me. I'm not going to stop." Even though he was terrified, he wasn't going to show the fear. And clearly this ended up being quite grave for him, because he came to believe that Sarah Key, in his very own words, this is without Nick putting his words into his mouth, he says that this was a woman in black. And the gargoyle was not just connected with Key, it was Key. It was some hideous supernatural shapeshifter that could take on any form it so desired, and that's what it did. It showed up as a woman, as this woman in black. Because it maybe not totally doesn't understand human society, so it was just like, oh, if I show up as a woman and wear like a little black dress and maybe a bit, like, she was a bitch, like she was a real nasty bitch. She's like, well, I'm not gonna listen to you.
But this connects to the idea of ancient treasures being protected by spirits.
Yeah, treasure guardians.
Yeah, they're treasure guardians.
Yeah, treasure guardians. But it then starts crossing into shapeshifters, and that's what seems to come up in many of these stories, right? If there's some type of occult practice, and apparently there are these groups. There's these hidden groups that somehow possess the knowledge of how to control these entities, or how to actually themselves turn into other creatures through the same mechanism.
Wasn't that the old the old bargaining that they did in the Middle Ages?
Yes,
There were spells
Yeah.
so that you could interface with the spirit and bargain with them to get the treasure.
That's right. Yeah, but it never ends well. It's like those old stories of doing a deal with
Sometimes
the
you
devil.
get the treasure.
Well, very rarely. And in this case, he dropped dead. He dropped dead 8 years later while hanging around Stonehenge.
Yeah, but he's a multi-millionaire because he got the treasure.
I don't think he got the treasure. I mean, obviously, we don't know anything about King Arthur actually being real, and we never found his tomb. Although, in saying the way that the world's gone, maybe he did open the tomb. Like, maybe he did open the chamber and these horrible supernatural beasts are now engulfing the planet. I mean, look where we are. Maybe this is what happened. But essentially, the other suggestion is he was just terrified to death. Like, he was so terrified by this that ultimately it just overwhelmed him, and, you know, this is what was the result from it. But then there are other stories. Right? So this was told to Nick Redfern back in 2001 directly. But there are other stories of people that have had, you know, similar encounters with what appear to be groups possibly that know how to utilize this power or this. So let me just bring this up for you here. So I've got a lot of my notes across here. Actually, I should mention this one for you first. This is the strangest. Thank you. That's great. That's not helpful as I go through my notes here.
Sorry.
That's fine. So actually, let me tell you this story first, and then I'll come back to the group, which might be connected with, you know, the intelligence agencies. Not directly being the intelligence agencies, but certainly outsourced by them, I guess is the way to
Okay, here
describe
we
it.
go.
That's
Strap
how-
in, folks.
So I'll come back to that.
I'm
So-
just going to sit here working on my hot donkey images. You tell the story about MI5 conjuring demons.
I'm already repulsed by your attraction to mole people. Do you have to start mixing it in with donkey people?
Fellas, come on.
No. I mean, I know that some people are quite
I
indiscriminate.
made
but-
it. That's your taste. You said
That's
you
not
liked the donkey face. That's what I made. The donkey face and a human body.
Moving on. So this is the story of, it ends up being like an intergenerational kind of thing. We don't have the full names of these people, but it starts off with these three young couples. And these three young couples, they're trying to save enough money so that they can buy a house. And they decide to live together in this one particular house, and until they can obviously maybe get enough capital and move out. So they move into this house. And immediately after moving into this house, there's something that's just off. Like, there's something that is not necessarily completely to the point of a haunting yet, but there's a bad feeling, and, you know, it's starting to build up, and they know that there's something not good. There's these foul, nauseating odors that seemingly come out of the paintwork and up from the basement. And then they said that there was something that would, you know, make ghostly creaks and groans throughout the house, and it became quite obvious to them that they were living in a haunted house. Like, it was quite a haunted place. But none of them wanted to leave because, you know, they all had gotten together, they'd invested money, and they were trying to wait until the market went up so they could, you know, buy their own homes. So one of the couples, their grandparents, this is a Mrs. M, her grandparents actually come for a visit, and her grandmother is just simply, you know, listed as W. So this grandmother W, she's this tiny woman, but apparently she possesses these great psychic abilities, these brilliant psychic abilities. And she walks into the house, and immediately she's just like, that woman that's in the painting that's above your mantelpiece that was left here by the previous owners, yeah, she was poisoned and killed in the bedroom upstairs decades ago. And she's still living in the house.
Anyway, see you
And
later.
so, no, and she's like, you really need to get the hell out of here. Like, you need to get out of this place, this old mansion. And it's haunted, actually not by her. Like, she's around, it's not her. There's something completely inhuman in this house. Completely inhuman, and you have to get away from it. And, you know, they were convinced, yeah, there was something there, because immediately as she starts describing this beast, Grandmother W is thrown to the floor by some type of invisible monster, some beast that begins to choke her. Like, it's choking. No one can see anything happening. She's just there struggling for air. The grandfather says that she starts turning blue and rushes over to her and wrenches her free of the floor or whatever was attacking her. And she's okay. Like, she recovers. But her voice, she's just like, it happened because I was speaking to that lady. She was like psychically apparently talking to the form in the painting when this beast reared itself up. And she said, it's unlike anything I've ever seen before. It had stiff, wiry, orange-colored hair standing out from its head, its arms, and its torso. Its hands were curved into claws like those of a wolf. And the beast had threatened to kill her and had left cuts on her neck where the claws had gouged her flesh. It actually had done that. It had done that. So it was like a kind of a Clarita Villanova kind of, experience where there's an invisible beast, attacking her but leaving actual physical trace evidence. And so, she's like, you have to get out. You have to go. And none of these couples want to leave. That is, of course, until one of the couples, Mrs. N, that night is attacked by a huge, large bat that climbs into her bed.
Oh my God.
So this bat, it's actually not like, when I say huge, like it's a big, like flying fox-sized bat that somehow manages to get in the bed. It bites her foot, and then she starts screaming. So the other couples come running in. As they run in, they club this thing to the floor. This thing seems to be invincible. It just rises up after a big smash in the face. And then guess what it does? It doesn't fly out the window.
Rage, what's
it
up?
smashes
All
the window to
messages
get out.
sent in our chat
big-
must
how big is
adhere
this
to
thing?
kids
Flying
community
fox bat. It's like the
guidelines.
size of this
Click me
table,
to
like
get
a
a line
small
safe
dog.
Yeah,
chatting.
it's like it's a
Wingspan of the table.
Yeah,
but
wingspan
like
of the table, but it's
a
still
small dog.
a small creature, but big enough, right? And
Yeah, I mean, actual flying foxes in Australia are pretty scary.
they're,
Get up
they're,
close to
beau-
them.
they're actually beautiful creatures, but I love them. They're really lovely creatures.
Really, you'd want to
I'll
have
give
one
you a
as
shout out now,
pet?
Rachel.
Take it home.
Yeah, have
Some
you
out
seen
of
how
this
cute they are?
crazy battle.
Yeah, I have. I've actually fed flying foxes, so they just.
It's like a giant rat with wings.
No, they're beautiful. But anyway, they do carry hendrovirus, which can cause you to have hemorrhagic fever.
I'll
and
make
that
a
stuff.
flying fox hottie image for you then.
No, I'm good, okay? Is this all you use
Yeah, pretty
AI
much.
for? Okay.
Pretty much.
So after this thing had gone, this grotesque monster is clearly in the house, and they I don't know what happens. It's not exactly described as to what if they leave, but they must leave at some point. All these couples leave, and the grandmother leaves as well, obviously, because she was only visiting. But she ends up having this homestead. Like, she has this homestead, which I don't know how far away it is, but far enough. And it's this ranch house. And it's 10 years later. It's like 10 years after Grandma W has died. You have Uncle Jay.
Uncle Jay.
Uncle Jay is now living in Grandma W's house, right? After she's died. He claims that one evening when one of these couples was staying there, so the couple, of the grandmother, apparently they're sitting watching TV or something when this Uncle Jay comes down the stairs, and he's terrified. Like, he's absolutely terrified. And like, what's going on? And he's like, I just saw this weird thing. It was like a monster and had bristly orange colored hair that was poking out of its head, and it was like it just stepped out of the storage room and then stepped back in, and like, he was freaked. He was describing the exact same entity from a decade earlier that had attacked Grandma W in their house. And it's almost like this thing, right? This is what I was describing at the start of throwing down the psychic gauntlet, is that because she had challenged this thing, it had followed her home. It had gone into her homestead. So that kind of ended there, right? And everything kind of died down about these nocturnal visitations until another decade later. So it's 20 years later.
What is going on?
You've now got the couple, this Mr. and Mrs. M, who are this couple that have been through all these experiences. They are now living in this old ranch, and they've got their 9-year-old grandson with them. Now, they're looking forward to this comfortable stay. They've, come to stay in the house. And one evening, Mrs. M is awakened by this shuffling sound that is heading towards her grandson. Now, she opens up her eyes, and in the moonlight, there's this moonlight that's kind of shining through the window. She sees this grinning creature with its eyes hidden by these series of mottled lumps of some kind of hair. It's essentially a dogman kind of creature, right? That's in the house, lunging towards her grandson. Now, she jumps out of bed and somehow intercepts this thing, right? And grabs hold of a handful of this thick, long hair. She's desperately clutching. It's very physical.
Yeah,
up
wow.
until now, it's been invisible, it's very visible. And the grandfather, the grandfather, he jumps up and reefs back the curtains, right, to illuminate the entire room. And when he illuminates the entire room, this beast is like, very typical in the mythology, right? Like, it's vampiric in a way because it's affected by the light. But what's really strange about this case? You can go, look, maybe this is the kind of story where it's just been like a legend, it's been blown out of proportion. But Nick's pretty good with doing his research and, and finding, the origins of these stories. But there's something that really stands out about this, which is so strange, and it's not what you'd expect from someone making up a story. When they pull the curtain back, when the grandfather pulls the curtain back, he says he sees the beast. The beast, though, is wearing a light-coloured, tight-fitting one-piece suit.
What?
With a thin material that ended at the knees and elbows. It's wearing like those weird one-piece alien spacesuits that we hear in so many of these reports of ET beings. And it's like this super modern, like, space material that it's
Wait,
wearing.
is he saying that it's not a wolf thing anymore? It's something
No,
else.
it's still a wolf. It's still like a wolf-like monster, like a humanoid wolf-like monster.
But he's in, like-
wearing a spandex space
Right.
material.
He's in like a Lululemon outfit.
Yeah. Yeah. And he's like this thing, and you can see this bristly orange-colored hair protruding from its flattened, misshapen face. It's got thick, bulbous lips that are like over a snarling kind of smile. And the thing is like going towards the grandson, because she had stepped in the way, it couldn't get to him. And it just starts to shuffle back out through the doorway. But when it leaves this sickening odor of decay behind. What are these things? What
Yeah,
the
I
hell
mean,
are these things?
Let's assume that all of this is true. This is a real encounter. Absolutely true. Definitely happened.
So
Why would
Rage
it
Now,
need
please.
a
Go
active
follow
wear,
at Rage
like,
Now,
yoga
please. His
pants
channel,
suit?
Skickum Rage Now,
Why would a
please.
werewolf need that? Why would it be wearing that?
I have no idea. Like, this is what
Is
is
it-
so bizarre about
Is
this
it
story.
classic kind of transforming lycanthropy where it was a guy doing yoga and then he transformed or
Well,
something?
where is it? I'll bring up this other
by,
slide.
by the way,
Oh, here we go. Yeah, see?
flying foxes,
Look how adorable
freaking
they
adorable.
are.
I
See?
take it back.
They're absolutely adorable.
Super cute.
Actually, though, in saying that, like, let me bring this. Okay, I've got this one here. Wolf-like creature wearing pants is my comment here. So this is from February the 22nd in 1971. It relates to 35-year-old Donald Childs of Lawton in Oklahoma. Now, back in 1971 in Lawton, there was actually a spate of sightings, right, of this wolfman-like creature. Now, this poor guy, Donald, he has a heart attack. Like, he actually has not as in, like, the metaphoric heart attack. He literally
Yeah, he actually
pulls
has a heart
open his
attack.
door, or the curtain on his door to look outside, to see a werewolf drinking from his bird bath, and he has a heart attack. And after he's recovering in hospital, people are like, what happened? He's like, there's a freaking werewolf drinking from my bird bath. But not only that, it was wearing bike shorts. They were too tight for its body. The thing was wearing these pants that were too small for him. And people are like, this guy's crazy. He's had a heart attack. He's obviously suffering from hypoxia, lack of oxygen to the brain. This is why he's imagining it. But according to the reports, and I don't know if this was a Brad Steiger, it was. This is something that Brad Steiger investigated, right? Without knowing it, there was also a police officer from Lawton, Oklahoma that evening, Harry Edsel, who was in the precinct, who was receiving calls about something monstrous running down the street. It was dodging cars, it was hiding behind bushes, and it was getting up and running again. There were multiple reports of what appeared to be a monster sitting on a railing outside an apartment, wearing pants. On the same evening. Who's making this stuff up? Think about it, right? If you're going to say you're going to see a werewolf, you're not going to go to the point of saying, I saw a wolf man outside my house wearing bike shorts that were clearly too small for it. Like, why would you go to that level of detail?
Yeah, it just makes it so
Isn't
much
it
more absurd than it already is.
Absurd. It's really strange. So this particular guy who reported it to the police, he said that when it was outside the apartment, it was like 11:15 p.m., which was a couple of hours after the other sighting. He said he thought it was a practical joke because of the fact that it was wearing these pants and the way that it was perched on the railing. He thought maybe it was someone, but he was like, it was like a beastly form that could have been a cross between a wolf and then a monkey or an ape. Like, what is this thing? He said he knew it wasn't a joke when the thing turned around to look at him, and he said it was an obvious face. It wasn't a mask, and then it jumped 2 stories. But this thing was capable of jumping 2 stories. Then, of course, there was a group of soldiers nearby at Fort Still. This is 15 minutes later after this particular sighting. They were frightened and freely admitted that they were terrified by seeing one of these weird wolf-like monsters running past them wearing pants.
Multiple eyewitnesses of this thing.
So I go, what is this? Is this some type of escaped, Teen Wolf is where it kind of comes up, like the classic werewolf kind of idea that, you involuntarily cursed, and upon a full moon, you're even in the clothes you're wearing, you'll transmogrify into a wolf-like being, and that's why everything's too tight because your clothing's too tight. Maybe. But I tend to think this is part of the phenomenon. The phenomenon does this on purpose. It adds these little details. It adds these, strange elements to it just to keep people like, huh? You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't want people to lock on to an understanding of what this is, so it deliberately makes it
Ooh.
absurd and strange. And of course, people are reporting
We got a
this.
legendary key
Most people go,
chance.
oh
Mute
yeah, okay,
in
yeah. So
the
hang on.
cube to open
Yeah,
a portal to
911.
the echoing
What's that?
nightmare.
You had a wolf
What?
man wearing bike shorts at the front of your house, did you? Oh, okay. You know what I mean? Like that's what the reaction's going to be. But when you get people like Brad Steiger, researchers starting connecting the dots on these stories, not everyone can be making this up. Not everyone wants that kind of attention. You know, like how many people are really going to call a police station to say, look, I saw a wolf man outside my house?
What is it then?
I don't know. There was one story which I didn't include in here, and it's really quite far out. And Nick, admits this. And again, this is, you can't, like sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, so you can't throw everything out. But this guy contacted Nick with allegedly the answer to the whole chupacabra myth.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And he was like, well, what is it? And he's like, it's Tasmanian tigers.
What?
And he's like, what do you mean? It's
With spines.
No, well, kind of. Like he claims that it's a group of Tasmanian tigers that the Americans were experimenting upon because Tasmanian tigers have extremely strong jaw strength, like very strong jaw strength.
When did they go extinct, though?
I think 1930s that these things went extinct. I think the last one died in the
Yeah, there's an
1930s.
image of one in Washington, D.C. Zoo in 1903.
Right. Okay. So I think it was, but in saying that, these things, people still claim to see them to this day. Like there's these anecdotal reports of people saying that they, spectacular creatures that they,
Yeah, there's some pretty convincing reports.
very convincing reports. Yeah. I mean, there's also your Rex Gilroy reports of them as well.
Yeah.
But there are, there's people. In fact, I have a friend who claims that she insists, and I believe her, that she saw one of these things in Victoria. She was just driving along and just ran out in front of her, and she was insistent that there's no doubt about it. I mean, they're very distinct creatures, and these things are still around.
Well, it's the stripes. I mean, you could obviously see a wild dog and think, okay, maybe I saw something like that, but
Yeah.
it's the stripes that give it away.
So this guy claimed to Nick that what had happened was that the military had somehow retained, I don't know, genomic samples, something, a breeding population of them. I really don't know. The fact that they allegedly went extinct in 1930 kind of, puts the kibosh on his story. But they were testing these creatures, and they had exposed them to some mutagenic virus or something like that to make them more aggressive, far more aggressive. Because what the idea was is that you would get them, and then you would release them on the battlefield. And it's, you don't have to send your soldiers out as cannon fodder, and they go and they, can tear up the enemy, and then you can send your soldiers through afterwards. And it kind of makes sense. We know with, obviously declassified reports now that the CIA and the military has experimented with bats was one good example, cats, that kind of thing. So it's not out of the realm of possibility. But to say, in the 1950s that they used some type of virus to cause them to become more aggressive and